Hello, welcome to the stream. Assuming you're still here, which you may well not be because the viewer number lies. Anyway, unfortunately, due to being disorganised, the alarm for my tea has yet to go off. I normally try to time it so it goes off in the muted period. Fortunately, before we start, I do have a slight point of order to address because, as you let's see, that's not capturing the right thing. Let's go entire screen. There we go. So, at the start of the book, are we looking forward? Sorry for all the clicking. Oh, that's a long forward. Right. Now there's the illustrations. Always fun. Here we are. So, in the beginning of the book, there is this reference to a holiday, which I believe happens in sort of October time. I did look that up. But I have been informed by a reliable source that this is not pronounced Michaelmas, which is what I pronounced it as, but it is in fact pronounced Michaelmas. I wouldn't want to spread misinformation on purpose, so yeah. To anyone who did not know the correct pronunciation, that is Michaelmas. Why it's Michaelmas, I haven't the faintest idea, but it is, so what can you do? Anyway, switch back to the background. There's the timer. Perfect. Tea's ready. So, I think I've just about got the hang of getting the drop off that lip teapot. It's quite good because the way that it's designed, it forces the drop to flow back away from the actual lip so it doesn't keep building up. So before I start, I just want to check one thing very quickly. Just go in here, and yeah, we are good to go. So, Pride and Prejudice, Chapter 8. Oh, actually, no, sorry, not quite good to go. Quick summary, in case for anyone who's watching this without watching the other one, and also because it's been a while since I did the first chapters. So essentially, what's just happened is that Jane Bennet, the eldest of the daughters and the one who is sort of floating around Mr. Bingley, and who Mr. Bingley is floating around, went to visit at Netherfield at the invitation of Miss Bingley, Mr. Bingley's sister, and travelled through the rain and came down with a violent cold. And Elizabeth just went to Netherfield, which is where Mr. Bingley lives, to accompany her sister, and has stayed and has just agreed to stay the night. Without further ado, Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock the two ladies retired to dress, and at 6:30 Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. To the civil inquiries which then poured in, and amongst which she had the pleasure of distinguishing the much superior solicitude of Mr. Bingley, she could not make a very favourable answer. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves, and then thought no more of the matter. And their indifference toward Jane, when not immediately before them, restored Elizabeth to the enjoyment of all her original dislike. The brother, indeed, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attentions to herself most pleasing, and they prevented her from feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed she was considered by the others. She had very little notice from any but him. Miss Bingley was engrossed by Mr. Darcy, her sister scarcely less so, and as for Mr. Hurst, by whom Elizabeth sat, he was an indolent man, who lived only to eat, drink, and play at cards, who, when he found her when he found her prefer a plain dish to a ragout, had nothing to say to her. When dinner was over, she returned directly to Jane, and Miss Bingley began abusing her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She had no conversation, no style, no taste, no beauty. Mrs. Hurst thought the same, and added, "She has nothing, in short, to recommend her, but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild. Oh, wait, no. Hang on. Forgot to do the voice. Dreadful. Not that the voice would be all that good. She has nothing, in short, to recommend her, but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly keep my countenance. Very nonsensical to come at all. Why, she must be scampering about the country because her sister had a cold. Her hair so untidy, so blowsy. Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat, 6 inches deep in mud. I'm absolutely certain. And the gown, which had been let down to hide it, not doing its office." "Your picture may be very exact, Louisa." "Your picture may be very exact, Louisa," said Bingley. "But this was all lost on me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice." "You observed it, I'm sure, Mr. Darcy," said Miss Bingley, "and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition." "Certainly not." "To walk 3 miles, or 4 miles, or 5 miles, or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt, and quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country-town indifference to decorum." "It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing," said Mr. Bingley. "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," observed Miss Bingley in a half-whisper, "that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." "Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." A short pause followed this speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. "I have an excessive regard for Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it." I'm assuming this is Mr. Darcy. It's not completely clear. I think it is. "I think I've heard you say that her uncle is an attorney in Meryton." "Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside." "That is capital," added her sister, and they both laughed heartily. "If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside," cried Bingley, "it would not make them one jot less agreeable." "But it must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world," replied Darcy. To this speech Bingley made no answer, but his sisters gave it their hearty assent, and indulged their mirth for some time at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar relations. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they repaired to her room on leaving the dinner parlour, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all till late in the evening, when she had the comfort of seeing her sleep, and when it appeared to her rather right than pleasant that she should go downstairs herself. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at loo. I'm going to have to look that up later. And was immediately invited to. Actually, I'll tell you what I can do. Sorry, I'm ruining the flow a little bit, but let me just. I'm going to highlight that because yesterday I tried to find something and I couldn't see it in the Sherlock to look it up, so I had to leave it. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at loo, and was immediately invited to join them, but suspecting them to be playing high, she declined it, and making her sister the excuse, said she would amuse herself for the short time she could stay below with a book. Mr. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. "Do you prefer reading to cards?" said he. "That is rather singular." "Miss Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, "despises cards. She is a great reader, and has no pleasure in anything else." I deserve neither praise, I deserve neither such praise nor such censure, cried Elizabeth. I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things. In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure, said Mr. Bingley, and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well. Elizabeth thanked her from her heart, and then walked towards a table where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever looked into. Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. I am astonished, said Miss Bingley, that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy. It ought to be good, he replied. It has been the work of many generations. And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be half as delightful as Pemberley. I wish it may. But I would really advise you to make your purchase in that neighbourhood and take Pemberley for a kind of model. There is no finer county in England than Derbyshire. With all my heart I will buy Pemberley itself if Darcy will sell it. I am talking of possibilities, Charles. Upon my word, Caroline, I should think it more possible to get Pemberley by purchase than by imitation. Elizabeth was so much caught by what passed as to leave her very little attention for her book, and soon, laying it wholly aside, she drew near the card table and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to observe the game. Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring? Said Miss Bingley. Will she be as tall as I am? I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller. How I long to see her again. I never met with anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age. Her performance on the pianoforte is quite exquisite. It is amazing to me, said Bingley, how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they are. All young ladies are accomplished, my dear Charles. What do you mean? Yes, all of them, I think. They all paint tables, cover screens, and net purses. I scarcely know any one who cannot do all this, and I am sure I've never heard of a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was very accomplished. Your list of the common extent of accomplishments, said Darcy, has too much truth. The word is applied to many a woman who deserves it no otherwise than by netting a purse or covering a screen. But I am very far from agreeing with you in your estimation of ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen in the whole range of my acquaintance who are really accomplished. Nor I am sure, said Miss Bingley. Then, observed Elizabeth, you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman. Yes, I do comprehend a great deal in it. Oh, certainly, cried his faithful assistant. No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, dancing, drawing, and the modern languages to deserve the word, and besides all this she must possess a certain something in her air and in manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. All this she must possess, added Darcy, and to all she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. I never saw such capacity and taste and application and elegance as you describe united. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, and were both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description, when Mr. Hurst called them to order with bitter complaints of their inattention to what was going forward. As all conversation was thereby at an end, Elizabeth soon afterward left the room. Eliza Bennet, said Miss Bingley, when the door was closed on her, is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own.
And with many men, I dare say, it succeeds, but in my opinion it is a paltry device, a very mean art.
Undoubtedly, replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. There is meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable. Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. Elizabeth joined them again, only to say that her sister was worse and that she could not leave her. Bingley urged Mr. Jones's being sent for immediately, while his sisters, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended an express to town for one of the more eminent physicians. This she would not hear of, but she was not so unwilling to comply with their brother's proposals, and it was settled that Mr. Jones would be sent for early in the morning, if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every possible attention might be paid to the sickly lady and her sister. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the inquiries which she very early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid, and some time afterward from the two elegant ladies who waited on his sisters. In spite of this amendment, however, she requested to have a note sent to Longbourn desiring her mother to visit Jane and form her own judgment of the situation. The note was immediately dispatched, and its contents as quickly complied with. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two youngest girls, reached Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. Had she found Jane in any apparent danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been very miserable, but being satisfied on seeing her that her illness was not alarming, she had no wish of her recovering immediately, as her restoration to health would probably remove her from Netherfield. She would not listen, therefore, to her daughter's proposal of being carried home, neither did the apothecary, who arrived about the same time, think it at all advisable. After sitting a little while with Jane on Miss Bingley's appearance and invitation, the mother and three daughters all attended her in the breakfast parlour. Bingley met them with the hopes that Mrs. Bennet had not found Miss Bennet worse than she expected.
Indeed I have, sir, was her answer. She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness.
Removed? Cried Bingley.
It must not be thought of. My sister, I am sure, will not hear of her removal. You may depend on it, ma'am, said Miss Bingley with cold civility, that Miss Bennet shall receive every possible attention while she remains with us.
Mrs. Bennet was profuse in her acknowledgments.
I am sure, she added, if it was not for such good friends, I do not know what would become of her, for she is very ill indeed, and suffers a vast deal, though the greatest patience in the world, which is always the way with her. Though with the greatest patience in the world, which is always the way with her, for she has, without exception, the sweetest temper I ever met. I often tell my other girls that they are nothing to her. You have a sweet room here, Mr. Bingley, and a charming prospect over that gravel walk. I do not know a place in the country that is equal to Netherfield. You will not think of quitting it in a hurry, I hope, though you have but a short lease.
Whatever I do is done in a hurry, replied he, and therefore I should resolve to quit Netherfield. If I should resolve to quit Netherfield, I should probably be off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself quite fixed here.
That is exactly what I should have supposed of you,
said Elizabeth. You begin to comprehend me, do you? Cried he, turning towards her.
Oh, yes, I understand you perfectly.
I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through, I am afraid, is pitiful.
That is as it happens. It does not necessarily follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours.
Lizzie, cried her mother,
remember where you are, and do not run in the wild manner that you are suffered to do at home.
I did not know before, continued Bingley immediately, that you were a sturdier of character. That's a weird sentence. It must be an amusing study. Oh, no, that's it. A studier of character. I did not know before, continued Bingley immediately, that you were a studier of character. It must be an amusing study.
Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage.
The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood, you move in a very confined and unvarying society.
But people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever.
Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet. offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighbourhood.
"I assure you there is quite as much of that going on in the country as in the town."
Everyone was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continued her triumph.
"I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country, for my part, except shops and public places. The country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley?"
"When I am in the country," he replied, "I never wish to leave it, and when I am in the town it is pretty much the same. They have each their advantages, and I can be equally happy in either."
"Ay, that is because you have the right disposition, but that gentleman," looking at Darcy, "seemed to think the country was nothing at all." "Indeed, mamma, you are mistaken," said Elizabeth, blushing for her mother. "You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there was not such a variety of people to be met within the country as in the town, which you must acknowledge to be true." "Certainly, my dear, nobody said there were. But as not to meet with many people in this neighbourhood, I believe that there are few neighbourhoods larger. I know we dine with 24 families."
Nothing but concern for Elizabeth would enable Bingley to keep his countenance. His sister was less delicate, and directed her eye towards Mr. Darcy with a very expressive smile. Elizabeth, for the sake of saying something that might turn her mother's thoughts, now asked if Charlotte Lucas had been at Longbourn since her coming away.
"Yes, she called yesterday with her father. What an agreeable man Sir William is. Mr. Bingley, is he not? So much the man of fashion, so genteel and so easy. He always has something to say to everybody. That is my idea of good breeding. And those persons who fancy themselves very important and never open their mouths quite mistake the matter." "Did Charlotte dine with you?" "No, she would go home. I fancy she wanted about the mince pies. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I always keep servants that can do their own work. My daughters are brought up differently."
Hmm. She was wanted about the mince pies. I see.
Ah, dear. I should probably pre-read these, but no. But everybody is to judge for themselves, and the Lucases are a very good sort of girls. I assure you, it is a pity that they are not handsome. Not that I think Charlotte is so very plain, but then she is our particular friend. One moment, I just have to sort something. Sorry about that.
She seems a very pleasant young woman, said Bingley.
"Oh, yes, dear, but you must know she is very plain. Lady Lucas herself has often said so, and envied me Jane's beauty. I do not like to boast of my own charm, but to be sure, Jane, one does not often see anybody better looking. It is what everybody says. I do not trust my own partiality. When she was only 15, there was a gentleman Gardner's own, my brother Gardner's in town, so much in love with her that my sister-in-law was sure he would make her an offer before we came away. But, however, he did not. Perhaps he thought her too young. However, he wrote some verses on her, and very pretty they were." "And so ended his affection," said Elizabeth impatiently. "There has been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love."
I have always considered poetry as the food of love, said Darcy.
"Of a fine, stout, healthy love, it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it be only if it only be a slight, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it away entirely."
Darcy only smiled, and the general pause which ensued made Elizabeth tremble lest her mother should be exposing herself again. She longed to speak, but could think of nothing to say, and after a short silence, Mrs. Bennet began repeating her thanks to Mr. Bingley for his kindness to Jane, with an apology for troubling him also with Lizzie. Mr. Bingley was unaffectedly civil in his manner, and forced his younger sister to be civil also and say what the occasion required. She performed her part indeed without much graciousness, but Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, and soon afterwards ordered her carriage. Upon this signal, the youngest of her daughters put herself forward. The two girls had been whispering to each other often during the whole visit, and the result of it was that the youngest should tax Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the country to give a ball at Netherfield. I didn't put my phone on silent. I'm now being bothered by Amazon, of all things. Lydia was a stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humoured countenance, a favourite with her mother, whose affection had brought her into public at an early age. She had high animal spirits, and a sort of natural self-consequence which the attention of the officers to whom her uncle's good dinners and her own easy manners recommended her had increased into assurance. She was very equal, therefore, to address Mr. Bingley on the subject of the ball, and abruptly reminded him of his promise, adding that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep it. His answer to this sudden attack was delightful to her mother's ear. "I am perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement. And when your sister is recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball. But you would not wish to be dancing while she is ill." Lydia declared herself satisfied. "Oh yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane was well. And by that time, most likely, Captain Carter will be at Meryton again. And when you have given your ball," she added, "I shall insist on their giving one also. I shall tell Colonel Forster it will be quite a shame if he does not." Mrs. Bennet and her daughters departed, and Elizabeth returned to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behaviour to the remarks of the two ladies and Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom, however, could not be prevailed on to join in the censure of her, in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. One moment. Right then. Chapter 10. The day passed much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with the invalid, who continued, though slowly, to mend, and in the evening Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing-room. The loo table, however, did not appear. I'm pretty sure that that's a form of... it must be a card game, because Mr. Hurst was complaining that he likes cards. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letters and repeatedly calling off his attention by messages to his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were at picket. That's weirdly spelt. I'll look that up later. And Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. Elizabeth took up some needlework and was sufficiently amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companion, the perpetual commendation of the lady either on his handwriting, or on the evenness of his lines, or on the length of his letter, with the perfect unconcern with which her praises were received, formed a curious dialogue, and was exactly in unison with her opinion of each. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter." He made no answer. "You write uncommonly fast." "You are mistaken. I write rather slowly." How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of a year? Letters of business, too. How odious I should think them." "It is fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of to yours." "Pray tell your sister that I long to see her." "I have already told her so once by your desire."
"I am afraid you do not like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well."
"Thank you, but I always mend my own."
"How can you contrive to write so evenly?"
He was silent.
"Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table. I think it infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's."
"You will give me leave to defer your raptures till I write again? At present I do not have room to do them justice."
"Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But you do always write in such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy." "But do you always write such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy?"
"They are generally long, but whether always charming it is not for me to determine."
"It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill."
"That will not do for a compliment. No, wait, hang on.
"That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline," cried her brother, "because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do you not, Darcy?"
My style of writing is very different from yours."
"Oh," cried Miss Bingley, "Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots the rest." My ideas flow so rapidly I do not have the time to express them, by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents. Your humility, Mr. Bingley, said Elizabeth, must disarm reproof. Nothing is more deceitful, said Darcy, than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast. And which of the two do you call my little piece of recent modesty? The indirect boast. For you are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and a carelessness of execution, which, if not estimable, you think at least highly interesting. The power of doing anything with quickness is always much prized by the possessor, and often without any attention to the imperfection of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that you ever resolved on quitting Netherfield, if you ever resolved on quitting Netherfield, you should be gone in 5 minutes. You meant it to be a sort of panegyric of compliment to yourself, and yet there is so very laudable. What is there so very laudable in the precipitance which must leave very necessary business undone, and can be of no real advantage to yourself or anyone else? Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much. To remember at night all the foolish things that were said in the morning, and yet, upon my honour, I believe what I said of myself to be true. I believe it at this very moment. At least, therefore, I did not assume the character of needless precipitance, merely to show off before the ladies. I dare say you believed it, but I am by no means convinced that you would not be gone with such celerity. Your conduct would be as dependent on chance as that of any man I know, and if, as you were mounting your horse, a friend were to say, Bingley, you had better stay till next week, you would probably do it, and you would probably not go, and at another word you might stay a month. You have only proved this, cried Elizabeth, that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You have shown him off now much more than he did himself. I am exceedingly gratified, said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper. But I am afraid that you are giving it a turn that the gentleman did by no means intend, for he would certainly think the better of me if, under such a circumstance, I were to give a flat denial and ride off as fast as I could. Will Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intention as atoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it? Upon my word, I cannot exactly explain the matter. Darcy must speak for himself. You expect me to account for opinions which you choose to call mine, but which I have never acknowledged. Allowing the case, however, to stand according to your representation, you must remember, Miss Bennet, that the friend who is supposed to desire his return to the house and the delay of his plan has merely desired it, asked it without offering one argument in favour of its propriety. To readily, to readily, to yield readily, easily, to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. To yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. You appear to me, Mr. Darcy, to allow nothing for the influence of friendship and affection. A regard for the requester would often make one yield readily to a request without waiting for arguments to reason one with it. I am not particularly speaking of such a case as you have supposed about Mr. Bingley. We may as well wait, perhaps, till the circumstance occurs, and then we can discuss the discretion of his behaviour thereupon. But in general and ordinary cases, between friend and friend, where one of them is desired by the other to change a resolution of no very great moment, should you think ill of that person for complying with the desire, without waiting to be argued into it? Will it not be advisable, before we proceed on this subject, to arrange with rather more precision the degree of importance which is to appertain to this request, as well as the degree of intimacy subsisting between the parties? By all means, cried Bingley. Let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting. No, my scroll wheel is playing up. By all means, cried Bingley. Let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and size, for that will have more weight in the argument. Miss Bennet, For that will have more weight in the argument, Miss Bennet, than you be aware of. I assure you that if Darcy were not such a great tall fellow in comparison to myself, I should not pay him half so much deference. I declare that I do not know a more awful object than Darcy on particular occasions, and in particular places, at his own house especially, and of a Sunday evening, when he has nothing to do. Mr. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she could perceive that he was rather offended, and therefore checked her laugh. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received,
in an expostulation with her brother for talking such nonsense. "I see your design, Bingley," said his friend. "You dislike an argument and want to silence this." "Well, perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet will defer yours till I am out of the room, I shall be very thankful, and then you may say whatever you like of me." "What you ask, Miss Elizabeth," said Elizabeth, "is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish his letter." Mr. Darcy took her advice, and did finish his letter. When that business was over, he applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for the indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley moved with alacrity to the pianoforte, and after a polite request, said Elizabeth would lead the way, which the other as politely and more earnestly negatived. She se- and after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead the way, which the other as politely and more earnestly negatived, she seated herself. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister, and while they were thus employed, Elizabeth could not help observing, as she turned over some music books that lay on the instrument, how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She hardly knew how to suppose that she could be an object of admiration to so great a man, and yet that he should look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She could only imagine, however, at last, that she drew his notice because there was something about her more wrong and reprehensible according to his ideas of right than in any other person present. The supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the charm by a lively Scotch air, and soon afterwards Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, "Do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel?" She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question with some surprise at her silence. "Oh," said she, "I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste. But I always delight in overthrowing those kinds of schemes, and cheating a person of the premeditated contempt. I have, therefore, made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all, and now despise me if you dare." "I indeed do not dare." Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry, but there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that, were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. Miss Bingley saw or suspected enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of their supposed marriage and planning his happiness in such an alliance. "I hope," she said, as they were walking together in the shrubbery the next day, "you will give your mother-in-law a few hints, when this desirable event takes place, as to the advantage of holding her tongue, if you can compass it, to cure the younger girls of running after officers, and if you can compass it. And if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavour to check that little something bordering on conceit and impertinence which your lady possesses." "Have you anything less to propose for my domestic felicity?" "Oh, yes. Do not let the portraits of your uncle and Aunt Phillips be placed in the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great uncle the judge. They are in the same profession, you know, only in different lines. As for your Elizabeth's picture, you must not attempt to have it taken, for what painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes?" "It would not be easy indeed to catch that expression, but their colour and shape and the eyelashes so remarkably fine might be copied." At that moment they were met from another walk by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. "I did not know that you intended to walk," said Miss Bingley in some confusion, lest they had been overheard. "You used us abominably ill," answered Mrs. Hurst, "running away without telling us that you were coming out." Then, taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted three. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness, and immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go into the avenue." But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, "No, no, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped, and appear to have uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoiled by admitting a fourth. Good-bye." She then ran gaily off, rejoicing as she rambled about in the hope of being at home again in a day or two. Jane was already so much recovered as to intend leaving her room for a couple of hours that evening. Right, I'm just going to go and make another cup of tea. and then I will be right back.
Took a little bit longer than I'd anticipated, but I got distracted talking about Pride and Prejudice and zombies. Terrible film, excellent book. You should read the book, by the way. And if you like this, read the book. It's fantastic. It's basically just this, but the women are a little bit more independent because it was written in the modern day, and the style is just. Honestly, it could have been written in an alternate universe in this exact time period, which is obviously the point. Anyway, chapter 11. When the ladies removed after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister, and seeing her well guarded from cold, attended her into the drawing room, where she was welcomed by her two friends with many professions of pleasure, and Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentlemen appeared. Their powers of conversation were considerable. They could describe an entertainment with accuracy related to an anecdote with humour. Describe an entertainment with accuracy, relate an anecdote with humour, and laugh at their acquaintance with spirit. But when the gentleman entered, Jane was no longer the first object. Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned towards Darcy, and she had something to say to him before he had advanced many steps. He addressed himself directly to Miss Bennet with a polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow and said he was very glad. Tea's ready. Sorry about that. I thought it better to start reading rather than wait in silence for the timer. If I had a larger audience to chat with, I probably would do that sooner than be interrupted in the middle of a paragraph, but just 1 second. Where was I? Mr. Hurst also made her a slight bow, and said he was very glad, but diffuseness and warmth remained for Bingley's salutation. He was full of joy and attention. The first half-hour was spent in piling up the fire, lest she should suffer from the change of room, and she removed, at his desire, to the other side of the fireplace, that she might be farther from the door. He then sat down by her, and talked scarcely to anyone else. Elizabeth, at work in the opposite corner, saw it all with great delight. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law of the card-table, but in vain. She had obtained private intelligence that Mr. Darcy did not wish for cards, and Mr. Hurst soon found even his open petition rejected. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the whole party on the subject seemed to justify her. Mr. Hurst had, therefore, nothing to do but stretch himself on one of the sofas and go to sleep. Darcy took up a book. Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with her bracelets and rings, joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She did not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way! I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I do not have an excellent library." No one made any reply. She then yawned again, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes round the room in quest of some amusement. When hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly towards him and said, "By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you, before you determine on it, to consult the wishes of the present party. I am much mistaken if there are not some among us to whom a ball would be rather a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," cried her brother, "he may go to bed if he chooses, before it begins. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing. As soon as Nicholas has made white soup enough, I shall send round my cards." "I should like balls infinitely better," she replied, "if they were carried on in a different manner. But there is something insufferably tedious in the usual process of such a meeting. It would surely be much more rational if conversation instead of dancing made the order of the day." "Much more rational, my dear Caroline, but I dare say it would not be near so much like a ball." Miss Bingley made no answer, and soon afterwards got up and walked about the room.
Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, was still inflexibly studious. In the desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one more effort, and turning to Elizabeth, said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude."
Elizabeth was surprised, but agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up. He was as much awake to the novelty of attention in that quarter as Elizabeth herself could be, and unconsciously closed his book. He was directly invited to join their party, but he declined it, observing that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, with either of which motives his joining them would interfere. What could he mean? She was dying to know what could be his meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether she could at all understand him. "Not at all," was her answer. "But depend upon it, he means to be severe on us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it." Miss Bingley, however, was incapable of disappointing Mr. Darcy in anything, and persevered, therefore, in requesting an explanation. Delightful. In requiring an explanation of his two motives. "I have not the smallest objection to explaining them," said he, as soon as she allowed him to speak. "You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are in each other's confidence, and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. If the first, I should be completely in your way, and if the second, I can admire you much better as I sit by the fire." "Oh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley. "I never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "Nothing so easy, if you have but the inclination," said Elizabeth. "We can all plague and punish one another. Tease him, laugh at him. Intimate as you are, you must know how it is to be done." "But upon my honour, I do not. I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Tease calmness of temper and presence of mind." "No, no, I feel he may defy us there."
Sorry, I'm getting distracted. I'm getting distracted by my Earl Grey. It's too hot still, but gotta love the smell of bergamot.
"No, no, I feel he may defy us there. And as to laughter, we will not expose ourselves, if you please, by attempting to laugh without a subject. Mr. Darcy may hug himself." "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," cried Elizabeth. "That is an uncommon advantage, and uncommon I hope it will continue, for it would be a great loss to me to have many such acquaintance. I dearly love a laugh."
"Miss Bingley," said he, "has given me credit for more than can be. The wisest and best of men, nay, the wisest and best of their actions, may be rendered ridiculous by a person whose first object in life is a joke."
"Certainly," replied Elizabeth, "there are such people, but I hope that I am not one of them. I never ridicule what is wise and good. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But these, I suppose, are precisely what you are without."
Perhaps that is not possible for anyone, but it has been the study of my life to avoid those weaknesses which often expose a strong understanding to ridicule.
"Such is vanity and pride."
Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will be always under good regulation. Ugh. Sentence structure of the 1813s. Dreadful. Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile.
"Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume," said Miss Bingley. "And pray what is the result?" "I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect. He owns it himself without disguise."
"No," said Mr. Darcy, "I have made no such pretension. I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. It is, I believe, too little yielding, certainly too little for the convenience of the world. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others so soon as I ought, nor their offences against myself. My feelings are not puffed about with every attempt to move them. My temper would, perhaps, be better called resentful. My own good opinion, once lost, is lost for ever."
"That is a failing indeed," cried Elizabeth. "Implacable resentment is a shade of character. But you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it. You are safe from me."
There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, a natural defect which not even the best education can overcome.
"And your defect is a propensity to hate everyone." And yours, he replied with a smile, is wilfully to misunderstand them.
Do let us have a little music, cried Miss Bingley, tired of a conversation in which she had no share. Louisa, you will not mind my walking Mr. Hurst. Her sister made not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened, and Darcy, after a few moments' recollection, was not sorry for it. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. Chapter 12. In consequence of an agreement between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to her mother to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day. But Mr. Bennet, who had calculated on her daughters remaining at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, which would exactly finish Jane's week, could not bring himself to receive them with pleasure before. Her answer, therefore, was not propitious. At least, not to Elizabeth's wishes, for she was impatient to get home. Mrs. Bennet sent them word that they could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday.
Oh dear. Just run out.
Could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday, and in her postscript it was added that if Mr. Bingley and his sisters pressed them to stay longer, she could spare them very well. Against staying longer, however, Elizabeth was positively resolved, nor did she much expect it would be asked for, and, fearful, on the contrary, of being considered as an intrusion themselves needlessly long, she urged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately, and at length it was settled that their original design of leaving Netherfield that morning should be mentioned, and the request made. The communication excited many professions of concern, and enough was said of wishing them to stay at least till the following day to work on Jane, and till the following morning their going was deferred. Miss Bingley was then sorry that she had proposed the delay, for her jealousy and dislike of one sister much exceeded her affection for the other. The master of the house heard with real sorrow that they were to go soon, and repeatedly tried to persuade Miss Bennet that it would not be safe for her, that she was not recovered, but Jane was firm where she felt herself to be right. To Mr. Darcy it was welcome intelligence. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley was uncivil to her, and more teasing than usual to himself. He wisely resolved to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should now escape him. Nothing that could elevate her with hopes of influencing his felicity. Sensible that, if such an idea had been suggested, his behaviour during the last day must have material weight in confirming or crushing it. Steady to his purpose, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her through the whole of Saturday, and though they were at one time left by themselves for half an hour, he adhered most conscientiously to his book, and would not even look at her. On Sunday, after morning service, the separation so agreeable to almost all took place. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased at last very rapidly, as well as her affection for Jane. And when they parted, after assuring the latter of the pleasure it would always give her to see her either at Longbourn or Netherfield, and embracing her most tenderly, she even shook hands with the former, Elizabeth took leave of the whole party in the liveliest of spirits. They were not welcomed home very cordially by their mother. Mrs. Bennet wondered at their coming, and thought them very wrong to give so much trouble, and was sure Jane could have caught cold again. But their father, though very laconic in his expressions of pleasure, was really glad to see them. He had felt their importance in the family circle. The evening conversation, when they were all assembled, had lost much of its animation and almost all its sense by the absence of Jane and Elizabeth. They found Mary, as usual, deep in the study of thorough base and human nature, and had some new extracts to admire and some new observations of threadbare morality to listen to. Catherine and Lydia had information for them of a different sort. Much had been done, and much had been said in the regiment since the preceding Wednesday. Several of the officers had dined lately with their uncle, a private had been flogged, and it had actually been hinted that Colonel Forster was going to be married. That was a short chapter. Chapter 13. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennet to his wife, as they were at breakfast the next morning, that you have ordered a good dinner to-day, because I have reason to expect you in addition to our family party. What do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody that is coming, and I am sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her. I do not believe she often sees such at home. The person whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. A gentleman and a stranger? It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure. Why, Jane, you never dropped a word of this, you sly thing.
Well, I am sure I shall be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley. But, good Lord, how unlucky! There is not a bit of fish to be got today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. We must speak to Hill this moment.
It is not Mr. Bingley, said her husband. It is a person whom I never saw in the whole course of my life. This roused a general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and 5 daughters at once. After amusing himself some time with their curiosity, he thus explained: "About a month ago I received this letter, and about a fortnight ago I answered it, for I thought it a case of some delicacy, and requiring early attention. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases."
Oh, my dear, cried his wife, I cannot bear to hear that mention. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do not think it the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your children, and I am sure if I had been you I should have long tried to do something about it.
Jane and Elizabeth attempted to explain to her the nature of an entail. They had often attempted it before, but it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond the reach of reason, and she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters. In favour of a man whom nobody cared anything about. It is certainly a most inquisious affair. We've got all the vocab today, said Mr. Bennet, and nothing can clear Mr. Collins of the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to his letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself.
No, I am sure I shall not. I think it very impertinent of him to write to you at all, and very hypocritical. I hate such false friends. Why could he not keep on quarrelling with you as his father did before him?
Why, indeed, he does seem to have some filial scruples on that head, as you will hear. Hunsford, near Westerham, Kent, 15th of October. Dear Sir, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honoured father always gave me such uneasiness, and since I have the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach, but for some time I was kept back by my own doubts, fearing lest it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone with whom it had always pleased him to be at variance. There, Mrs. Bennet. My mind, however, is now made up on the subject, for having received ordination at Easter, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh, whose bounty and beneficence has preferred me to the valuable rectory of this parish, where it shall be my earnest endeavour to demean myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship, and be ever ready to perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England. As a clergyman, moreover, I feel it my duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families within the reach of my influence, and on these grounds I flatter myself that my present overtures of goodwill are highly commendable, and that the circumstance of my being next in the entail of Longbourn estate will kindly be overlooked on your side, and not lead to you to reject the offered olive branch. I cannot be otherwise than concerned at the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologise for it, as well as to assure you of my readiness to make every possible amends. But of this hereafter. If you should have no objection to receive me into your house, I propose to myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family, Monday, November 18th, by 4 o'clock, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday se'nnight, the following, which I can do without any inconvenience, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence on a Sunday, provided that some other clergyman is entailed to the duty of the day. I remain, dear sir, with respectful compliments to your lady and your daughters, your well-wisher and friend, William Collins.
Sorry, I've got something stuck. Just a tiny little thing in the back of my throat. I'm trying to get it out. Hopefully the talking will agitate it away. Or the tea will knock it loose, something like that. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennet as he folded up the letter.
He seems to be a most conscientious and polite young man, upon my word, and I doubt not will prove a valuable acquaintance, especially if Lady Catherine should be so indulgent as to let him come to us again. There is some sense in what he says about the girls, however, and if he is disposed to make any amends, I shall not be the person to discourage him. Though it is difficult, said Jane, to guess in what way he can mean to make the atonement he thinks our due. The wish is certainly to his credit. Elizabeth was chiefly struck with his extraordinary deference for Lady Catherine, and his kind intention of christening, marrying, and burying his parishioners whenever it were required. He must be an oddity, I think, said she. I cannot make him out. There is something very pompous in his style, and what can he mean by apologizing for being next in the entail? We cannot suppose that he would help it if he could. Can he be a sensible man, sir? No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. There is a mixture of civility and self-importance in his letter which promises well. I am impatient to see him. In point of comparison, said Mary, his letter does not seem defective. The ideal of an orange branch, of an olive branch perhaps, is not wholly new, yet I think it is well expressed. Not wholly new. Wow. Bloody Mary. To Catherine and Lydia, neither the letter nor its writer were in any degree interesting. It was next to impossible that their cousin should come in a scarlet coat, and it was now some weeks since they had received pleasure from the society of a man in any other colour. As for their mother, Mr. Collins's letter had done away with much of her ill will, and she was prepared to see him with a degree of composure which astonished her husband and daughters. Mr. Collins was punctual to his time, and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement nor inclined to be silent himself. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25 years. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. He had not long been seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters, and that he had said he had heard much of their beauty, but that in this instance fame had fallen short of the truth, and added that he did not doubt her seeing them all in due time well disposed of in marriage. This gallantry was not much to the taste of some of his hearers, but Mrs. Bennet, who quarrelled with no compliments, answered most readily. You are very kind, sir, I am sure, and I wish with all my heart it may prove so, for else they will be destitute enough. Things are settled so oddly. You allude, perhaps, to the entail of this estate. Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair to my poor girls, you must confess. Not that I mean to find fault with you, for such things, I know, are all chance in this world. There is no knowing how estates will go when once they come to be entailed. I am very sensible, madam, of the hardship to my fair cousins, and could say much on the subject, but I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitate. I can assure the young ladies that I come prepared to admire them. At present I will not say more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted. He was interrupted by a summons to dinner, and the girls smiled at each other. They were not the only objects of Mr. Collins's admiration. The hall, the dining room, and all its furniture were examined and praised, and his commendation of everything would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart but for the mortifying supposition of his viewing it all as his own future property. The dinner, too, in its turn, was highly admired, and he begged to know which of his fair cousins had the excellence of its cookery. Begged to know which of his fair cousins the excellence of its cookery was owing. But here he was set right by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were very well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased her. In a softened tone she declared herself not at all offended, but he continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. Chapter 14, the final chapter that we will be reading today. Unless it ends on a really annoying cliffhanger, then I might keep reading, but probably not. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all, but when the servants were withdrawn, he thought it time to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started a subject in which he expected him to shine, by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his wishes and consideration for his comfort appeared very remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated him to more than a usual solemnity of manner, and with a most important aspect he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behaviour in a person of rank, such affability and condescension as he himself experienced from Lady Catherine. She had been graciously pleased to approve of both the discourses which he had already had the honour of preaching before her. She had also asked him twice to dine at Rosings, and sent for him only the Saturday before to make up her pool of quadrille in the evening. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people, he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. She had always spoken to him as she would to any other gentleman. She made not the smallest objection of his joining in the society of the neighbourhood, nor to his leaving his parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even condescended to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion, and had once paid a visit to him in his humble parsonage, where she had perfectly approved all alterations he had been making, and had even vouchsafed to suggest some herself, some shelves in the closet upstairs. "That is all very proper and civil, I am sure," said Mrs. Bennet, "and I dare say that she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir?" "The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence." "I think you said she was a widow, sir. Has she any family?" "She has one only daughter. She has one only daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and of very extensive property." "Ah!" cried Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head. "Then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" "She is a most charming young lady, indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that in point of true beauty, Mr. Bull is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution which has prevented her in making that progress in many accomplishments which she could not otherwise have failed of, as I am informed by the young lady who superintended her education, and who still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to drive my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies. Drive by my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies." "Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court." "Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself once, has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed very pleased with the idea that you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are the kinds of little things that please her ladyship, and it is a sort of attention which I conceive myself peculiarly bound to pay." "You judge very properly," said Mr. Bennet, "and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. Might I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of a moment, or are the result of previous study?" "They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible." I'm just gonna. I've just got something to take care of after I pour this tea. Yeah. I just want to try and stop that whatever it is stuck in the back of my throat. Let me just mute for a moment. That feels a bit better. I've never gargled tea before, but it does seem to have helped a little bit. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he hoped, and listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and, except in an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. By tea time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest to the drawing room again, where tea was over, and when tea was over, glad to invite him To read aloud to the ladies, there we go. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back and begging pardon, protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia gaped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with, "You know, mamma, that my Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard, and if he does, Colonel Forster will hire him. My aunt told me so on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town." Lydia was bid by her 2 eldest sisters to hold her tongue, but Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction, but I will no longer importune my young cousin." Then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as his antagonist at backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologised most civilly for Lydia's interruption, and promised that it should not occur again if he would resume his book, but Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his younger cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behaviour as any affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet and prepared for backgammon. Which marks the end of today's reading. So, the plan now will be to... I will just switch to screen capture, skim through and look up a few things, and I will show the illustrations as well, of course. Yeah, right. So we want to go back up to the start of 8, which is here. There we go. So this is the covering of a screen that Mr. Darcy was talking about. One of the accomplishments of the women of the world. And I did highlight. I did go through, and what does that mean? So blowsy. I don't actually know whether blowsy, coarse, untidy, and red-faced, typically used of a woman. I'm guessing this hasn't been used for quite a while. Oh my god, it's actually used fairly consistently. Well, that's bizarre. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Lou cards. Card game. Historic card game. Lantaloo or Lou, here we go. It's a trick-taking card game of the Trump family. What are we going for? Fours. A bit like whist. Play a hand that sends a series of finite rounds called tricks. Objective, there we go. So the game is played with 3 to 8 players using a standard card pack. Play for tricks. In each round, they may pass or play. The main forms of the game are 3-card Loo, Irish Loo, 5-card Loo. Before play, each turn announces whether he will play or throw his hand. They will have to exchange cards from the pack. If all pass, the dealer wins. Okay. I can unhighlight that now. There we go. Let's see. I don't need to. I can just scroll rapidly because I've highlighted things now, so I will be fine. And here is Mrs. Bennet arriving with the 2 youngest daughters. As I say, this artist really does not do Mrs. Bennet any favours. It's George Allen. Every single picture that's got Miss Bennet in it. Although, ironically, she does have slightly more... She is more unique. Whereas the 2 youngest daughters, the faces are nearly identical. they call the rising sun. There's Mr. Darcy ignoring Miss Bennet. Not Miss Bennet, Miss Bingley. We've got a little illustration there. A picket. I'm guessing this is also a card game. Yeah. It's also a trick taking. It's basically a similar type of card game. Rules. It's played with a 32 deck. Normally referred to as a picket pack. 7s through 10s in the face cards. Six deals. Player scoring the most points wins. Yeah, this is one of these things that I could sit here and read through these rules, but it would be very dull, I fear. Yeah, it's basically it's a card game is the answer. Here we go. Panegyric. Panegyric.
Panegyric.
Oh, let me. I need to turn that on.
Panegyric.
Okay, so I'm not pronouncing that remotely correctly. Panegyric. Public speech or published text in praise of something or someone. Yeah, this is Mr. Darcy saying that Bingley is humble bragging, basically. And there's the Scotch airs. I wonder if I go here. I might just be able to. This is classic music, so it should be off copyright. Let's check. Fine, stream the out. No. No, I don't think. I think I would. I won't risk that. But yeah, so it's. Scottish airs for the voice, multi-volume collection. Yes, this is literally it's just Scottish music, basically. And here we've got the Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley monopolising Darcy while Elizabeth promptly sods off, not wanting to be anywhere near them. Let me see. And then we've got Mr. Bingley piling up the fire for Jane. It's a very bizarre, because obviously he's tried to draw it. You can see he's trying to draw it with him leaning over the fire, but it looks like he's leaning horizontally. The depth isn't quite right, I don't think. Though I shouldn't criticise too much. I mean, I wouldn't be able to draw anything remotely as good as this. I could barely draw a stick person. We've got a nice little illustrated W. I don't think there's too much left that I highlighted. Well, I think there is some. Let's have a look. There's a random carriage. And a very nice eye. I do like that. Propitious. Maybe no, that might be propitious. Let's see. That's not loaded.
Propitious.
Yeah, propitious. I did get that right. Well, I got it right now. I got it wrong the first time. Giving or indicating good chance of success. And we've got. I don't know what that's supposed to be. That was obviously supposed to be a man holding a very long vine and a man holding a book, looks like. And a very boring eye. Dreadful. This is Mr. Collins. Entail inheritance. Maybe if I just go in definition. Law, here we go. Limit the inheritance of property over a number of generations so that the ownership remains within a particular... a limitation of the inheritance of property to certain heirs over a number of generations. Yeah. So this is what it is. Not that one. This one. Yeah. And then we have inquisitus. Iniquitous. Oh, that's just going to be unequal, isn't it? Definitely got the pronunciation of that wrong. Iniquitous. Yeah, grossly unfair and morally wrong. Yeah. I don't know what that is. That's very bizarre. That might even be a typo. Sennight of a week. Saturday Sennight following. Saturday the week following. Yeah. I had not heard of that before. Come down. Asperity. That's presumably something to do with breathing or speaking. It could be from the similar root to aspirate. Harshness of tone or manner. Yeah. Where does that come from then? Aspirate. Aspiratas. Weird. I was completely wrong there. With some harshness of manner. Oh, that makes sense. Is Mrs. Bennet being with asperity? She would be, wouldn't she? You've got a nice little illustration of, I don't know what that's supposed to be. That's supposed to be Mr. Bennet and Mr. Collins. And then we have the chapter that was last. Strange little illustrated D. What a quadrille. Pool of quadrille. This has got to be another card game, hasn't it? Oh, it's a type of dance with four couples. Yeah, so he'd been invited to Rosings to dance, basically, by Lady Catherine. This is presumed. I'm guessing this is going to be a form of carriage. Yeah, that's a car. There we go. This is just a form of carriage. And then we've got Mr. Collins protesting that he doesn't read novels. And so yeah, I'm from what I remember of the plot, I'm pretty sure that Mr. Collins is going to he's basically going to suggest that he marry one of the girls, to ensure that they're not, the idea being that it will mean that the estate they don't have to leave, basically. And so this illustration is like not the same, not for sale, and this is Mr. Collins evaluating the five of them. I'm assuming that's Mary. She's reading. Right. Well, with that addressed, I shall end the stream. I hope you have enjoyed, and I hope you will return for the next section of the book. Without much further ado, good day and goodbye.